And it's not that you're going to act on any one of those pieces of information, but it's the amalgamation of that information that's important. I kind of suspect it's similar, but it can't possibly be the way that I did it at GitHub for Sundar or Satya. And there's no, he might talk to fellows and he might talk to a bunch of VPs, but I doubt I only met with Satya twice. Twice after we were acquired. And it was all pleasantries. It wasn't about finding out about that sort of stuff. So you can't possibly work at that scale, but it is an interesting problem, right? It's almost like running a government.
All right, welcome back to another edition of the Sourcegraph podcast. Today I'm here with Jason Warner, Managing Director at Redpoint Ventures, one of the first VC firms to invest seriously in developer tools. Prior to his investing career, Jason was CTO of GitHub, which he joined at perhaps the most challenging point in the company's history. He led a turnaround there and orchestrated the acquisition by Microsoft for around $7.5 billion, the largest dev tool acquisition at the time. Prior to that, Jason was VP of Engineering at Heroku and Head of Engineering on Ubuntu Desktop at Canonical. Interestingly enough, despite this very storied career at some of the best-known developer-oriented companies in Silicon Valley, Jason spent much of his early career outside of Silicon Valley, which is where we'll start today's conversation. Jason, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, to get things started, you've had a wild success at a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, mainly developer-oriented ones. But take us back to your beginnings as a programmer. Where did that story start for you?
Sure. So I didn't have the maybe perceived to be classical path to programming where somebody gets a laptop or computer at 3 and starts programming by 5, and their parents are yelling about how awesome they are by 8 and all that sort of stuff. Not even close. And so in fact, I didn't actually start programming until I was about 17, 18 years old. And it was because there was a high school co-op at IBM in the town that I lived in at the time that I even got exposed to this. We didn't have a computer in the house, all that sort of stuff. And my auto shop teacher mentioned that I should apply for this high school co-op because that's, I was the type of kid that was geared towards. And I got this high school co-op. I just started carrying computers and printers around the building, eventually started doing some light Lotus Notes development. And that's literally the first thing I started to develop.
Interesting. And this is at IBM. You're just like moving stuff around?
IBM in Southbury, Connecticut.
Cool. And like on the job, did you actually get to interact with the computers at all? Or was it basically just like carrying them around and doing stuff like that?
I mean, I got to interact with them. I got to set them up. I learned about what token ring and Ethernet was. Back then, token ring was still a thing back then.
I don't even know what that is. What is token ring?
It's a different type of networking standard that IBM was really trying to push back then. So internal to the buildings were all token ring. And eventually they swapped over to Ethernet inside the buildings too, as one does when some technology dies.
Got it. And so did the co-op lead directly into programming at all? Or was that just kind of like your first basic introduction?
It was kind of consider it a basic introduction to the entire world and concept of tech. And then what happened is, I learned about more stuff throughout that time. The funny story here is that the people at IBM said, hey, if you get a job, or say if you learn computer science at school, we'll give you a job afterwards. And the reason why that was so is they liked my work ethic and the fact that I wasn't stealing printers and computers from them, which I guess they had a problem with a little while before that too. So they said, hey, just go to school. If you want to get a computer science degree, we'll give you a job afterwards. And I quickly started trying to figure out what computer science was. It wasn't something I knew up to that point. So I did. I went to, and even so, when I went to Penn State undergrad, I started out as mechanical engineering, not thinking that computers were going to be for me. I was afraid that I was too late to the game and that I, wasn't going to work out for me. And then I realized I did not like bridges as much as mechanical engineering really, really wanted me to like bridges, apparently. So I said, I don't have a backup plan. I have no idea. So I just said, I'll look at computer science.
And what was the kind of computer science college experience like for you? Difficult, easy?
This was mid 90s, late 90s. So it was different, I think, than what people might have today. It was interestingly, it was actually an advantage for me at the time because it was a lot less programming and a lot more theory. So, math, stats, algorithms, all that sort of stuff, and a lot less hardcore programming. And in the hardcore programming classes, I did struggle until I figured it all out. But I was fine in all of the more theoretical classes.
Interesting. What was it about theory that made it easier for you, or about programming that was harder?
Well, I think what it was is I was starting from a deficit for the one in the classes with the programming background. So I was actually, well, you walk into Computer Science 101 C, it starts out with a base understanding or an expectation of base understanding. And I'm literally, in the first page, and there's no Google back then, I'm trying to figure out what the hell is a compiler? What is this? GCC, I get it. Like run the GCC command. Okay, what do I mean by command? Remember, I came from Lotus Notes background. So like Lotus Notes at the time was a GUI based programming language and stuff. So I was literally trying to figure out everything on the fly.
So I imagine it was one of those situations. Probably back then, the proportion of people in the computer science majors is a higher proportion of people who had experience with it. Kind of people who had like started earlier on, or their parents had a computer or something like that.
Yeah, so I would say the vast majority of them were that, and in the more classical Hollywood, Silicon Valley trope of what type of person goes into computer science back then, all that sort of stuff. But what I did realize too is like another advantages I had back then. One was the sophistication of development was not nearly as high as it is today. We didn't have the proliferation of languages and frameworks and all these different things. So it was like C and assembly and all that sort of stuff on a Linux or Unix mainframe or something like that, or a Windows machine or something like that. And two, the advent of the internet was happening right around that same time. In the early 90s, it kind of took off on college campuses. And by mid to late 90s, client server had given way to, servers and, running of those things. So once I realized that I was far behind on one side, but I could make up that advantage by literally diving into the one side of the technology that nobody had an advantage on because it was new, I just went all in on the internet and started learning about Linux and all the different subsystems there and how to run servers and all of that sort of stuff. So again, like I had a couple of disadvantages, but I tried to find ways to turn them into advantages.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. I feel like in technology, every couple of years or so, there's like a new wave or a new platform that emerges, and maybe kind of like a career hack is to be a first mover into those, because it's a bit of a level playing field, right? Like everyone else who's built up this institutional knowledge about yesteryear's platform doesn't have that.
I definitely think it's a career advantage. It's a definite hack. I also think the other hack to use is to figure out the ways in which the things that you do know apply to this new world, so you can short circuit the learning curves. So again, like I had to do a lot of this on my own for the first 5-10 years of my journey into this, which everyone has to when you're starting out. So everyone has to go through this. I just happened to be doing it in college. But now it's the exact same space. You know how it is to apply something new, like, hey, in your space, in infrastructure and distributed systems, you and I share some of these same backgrounds. Well, like how would we dive into ML, or how would we dive into AI, or how would we dive into crypto and deconstruct some of these things? It's not that hard to do once you know how to learn and know how to apply those things.
Yeah, for sure. And your unique background, I like to think that like everything happens for a reason. Like even stuff that you learn, you're like, I'm never going to use that again. Somehow it has this way of kind of reemerging later on in your career, where like you see some like weird connection to something new that everyone's hopping on that gives you a distinct advantage.
Well, interestingly, now that's true, because while I say that my background is basically a distributed systems engineer, that's great for a small class of large startups that can grow into a certain size and scale and scope. Smaller startups don't technically need that, but also 100% applies to all these large AI ML systems, but even more crypto as well too. You can like dive into like totally understand what's happening, or what's not happening behind the scenes in those spaces too.
Yeah, 100%. It's all coming back, which is awesome. Okay, cool. So you studied computer science. You're into theory in school. After graduation, what did you do? Did you go back and take that job at IBM?
I did. I went back to IBM. I was back in my hometown of Southbury, Connecticut. I was there for about a year. I was working on a system there called FanMail, which was the 2000 Sydney Olympics system. It's kind of like GeoCities plus Yahoo plus forums and all that sort of stuff, but like for the people who were attending the Olympics to converse and interact with the athletes at the time and stuff like that.
It's kind of funny to me that they would like hire IBM to build a system like that. I feel like these days it'd be like some web consultancy or some app builder, but I guess that speaks
I mean,
to
or just like literally using like 15 no code tools to pull this stuff together really
right,
quickly too.
right.
So,
Cool. Okay, so you did that. This is kind of like early web. What sort of tools were you building that in?
so that was thankfully also a little bit more modern for the time too. Like we used a DB2 backend. It was all Perl based. So CGI bin Perl. It was running on a more like modern system. So it allowed me again to like kind of use internet based tools and stuff like that. JavaScript, but this is way back when everyone's writing raw JavaScript. So that was great. But I then jumped from that system to working part time on another system inside of IBM, which was their internal resume handling system. And that was one incredibly large, convoluted C file. And not even joking, like it showed you the night and day of the
Like
different
literally
types
one
of
file, just like the whole
one
system.
file. And it was an internet-based file. It was like it had the server embedded in the file and the scaling of the
What?
server embedded. It was I tell you what, like I had no idea what was going on in that. Like it was, I had to fix one bug, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Like it compiled. I'm gonna go home for the weekend type of deal. It was hard. No test suites. No, obviously no test suites. Really, no like real harnesses or anything. It was really different than working on that first fan mail system.
That sounds like you're working on this sort of fun project, and then all of a sudden you got put on this just like bang your head against the wall, hair pulling exercise.
Well, back then too, it was anything that connected to the network, essentially, but particularly the internet, was an internet project. And there's very few people who knew how to write internet-based tools back then. And so, like this one very large C file, which basically had been maintained over the course of probably about 7 years, and was retrofitted to be its own server. So it was like running all of its own stuff. They said was one of their internet-based applications. Like we're gonna have to talk about your definitions here.
Cool. Okay, so you worked at IBM for a bit, and then you worked at kind of a series of startups through the '90s and like the early internet era. Tell us about that. What was that like?
So the chronology here is IBM. I then went to a startup company called Microcast, which was doing video streaming on the internet. So .com bubble, all that sort of stuff. What they did was tried to live stream sporting events as well as movies. MGM and Fox, I believe, if I remember correctly, were some of the larger customers. I remember having access to the entire Rocky catalog as an example, like while we were testing stuff to go stream this. And obviously you can imagine from a startup like that in the .com, like why it would be interesting and get funding, but also the technical problem, which is not a lot of people had the capacity to stream these things in the home at the time. It was last mile problem. So that went under the day before Thanksgiving in 2000. My wife is in medical school, or my wife to be is in medical school. I decided that I want to go get a really stable job. So I've told the story a couple of times, but I joined Enron. And that was, that classically turned out the way, and everyone knows Enron turned out.
Yeah. I mean, people forget this, but like Enron was really like super well respected and viewed as one of like the best run, companies in a certain period.
It's interesting because I'm going from the startup company that just went out of business. I'm talking to my friends, parents, family, everybody, and I'm like, my future wife's father and mother and everybody, and I was like, yeah, I got an offer from Enron, and they're like, oh my god, like, and you're like, yeah, I guess I got to take that job. It's a big stable job. That's what I got to get responsible here, right?
Yeah.
And and they were printing money. They were literally just printing money. They were the darling of Wall Street,
Okay, so what happened at Enron? Like, how long was your stint there?
So Enron was a real learning experience in retrospect for me because I stayed there. I think I was there just under a year. And I remember calling my mother up several times while I was at Enron saying, I don't think I'm cut out for tech because I don't know how this company makes money. I don't understand a thing about the business behind this company. And I don't actually understand what I'm doing. I was working on their Northeast Corridor trading system, like the energy trading system for the Northeast Corridor and all that, like how it hooks up and hooks into all these different systems and all that sort of stuff. And I I remember feeling so stupid. I was like, thought like all my lack of tech experience was catching up with me and all that sort of stuff. So I said, I'm going to go. There's another job available to me. It's all about DSL. So DSL provisioning, like you go physically have to like get the router out to people. You have to provision it. You have to like physically put the POTS lines in place and all that sort of stuff. And I'm going to build a system that's going to control all of that stuff. I understood everything about that. I was like, I think that's like my safe haven for now. And then obviously when Enron went under and later, and it wasn't even immediately when it went under because I still did not connect the two, but like years later, I realized like, oh yeah, it wasn't about me. It wasn't about me not understanding what was going on there. There's a reason why it was a little bit more difficult to parse.
Your intuition was right, it turns out.
Yeah, I just pointed it more at me than at the company.
Yeah. I feel like when you're first starting out too, it's like everyone has imposter syndrome to a certain extent, and you sometimes assume like if you don't understand how a system works, then it's like someone else much smarter than you does. But you'd be surprised. The more you experience in life, the more you realize how few people have any idea of what's going on.
I think that's the key thing that I learned in that, but also applied to like Silicon Valley too, which is, you start to realize that most people are just making up a lot of the stuff on the spot as we talk about, but also, it's hard. How do you apply something that you did learn 15 years ago or experienced 15 years ago to today's environment too? A lot of people can't make that jump, even though they have the intellectual knowledge too.
Yeah. 100%. Okay. So at this point, you're still kind of like, outside of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is kind of this like idea in your mind. What was your eventual path to, working at the first quote unquote like Silicon Valley company?
Fill in a couple of details here. So my wife and I moved to Arizona. She did her medical residency out there at Mayo. And then what happened is we moved to Australia. We had a couple of different life events that caused us to, reevaluate what we were doing. She wanted to go practice rural medicine. We decided on Australia. So I needed to find a remote job. I was at a startup company in Phoenix, running engineering for that. And I had already been embedded in the Python and Linux community because of, my previous experience at Penn State, but also continuing forward at the startup company. We were working on some of the first cloud systems running on AWS. So a number of connections in that space, and one of them was with Canonical. So a bunch of people told me that Canonical was looking for a desktop manager. And so I applied for that, knowing that I could do it remote. And it just worked out. And so I did Canonical remote from Australia for a couple of years, moved to British Columbia eventually in Victoria, where I live now. And a couple of Canonical people had jumped over to Heroku. And they had called up and said, hey, I know you're still at Canonical, but we need someone to kind of come in and help us shape up engineering and eventually run engineering here at Heroku. Are you interested? And I'd been super impressed with Heroku for a long time, massive user of it, and just always really respected what they did. And of course, I kind of jumped at that chance to go over there.
Cool. And where was Heroku at this point in its life cycle?
Heroku started out in San Francisco, and obviously, like as it eventually became the PaaS everyone knows it to be. But it started out as an online IDE, if anyone remembers this. Called Heroku Garden. It was a Rails editor.
I actually did not know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Started out as a Rails editor, and then what they saw, the early team saw, was that people were abusing it to host stuff. Because if anyone famously remembers, early Rails was a nightmare to keep running, and Heroku did it well. So they had just been acquired by Salesforce, which, if anyone remembers back when this happened, was a very head-scratching moment. Like, why is Salesforce acquiring Heroku? But they had just been acquired, and it kind of, I want to say about 9 months or so had passed, and kind of early Heroku people, pre-acquisition or just post, were kind of all leaving, and kind of another generation was coming in.
Got it. So it sounds like a pretty pivotal point in time for the company. What would you say were like the big initiatives and challenges for them at the point that you joined?
So Heroku had massive success already. It was a beast in terms of like its influence on the industry. And I still think of all the companies I worked for, Heroku was the most technologically savvy and advanced. It was one of the more interesting companies out there in general, and the things that they've done to the industry, I think, are just remarkable. I don't think we give them enough credit. but it was still, when I joined, it was still mostly, this is a little bit dismissive and it wasn't this, but it was still mostly a one product company. It was a product called Cedar, the multi-tenant version of Heroku. It did talk to Postgres databases, and we had our own Postgres fleet, and we were building an add-ons ecosystem, but we really did not have a real enterprise offering. We didn't have a lot of things around, that. And the company hadn't scaled just yet too. So I would say that was kind of where it was. So while I was there, we had launched things like Heroku Enterprise and Heroku, I think we ended up calling it Shield or something like that. And the add-ons marketplace grew tremendously, and the database business really grew. The database team at Heroku is phenomenal. But yeah, that was kind of where we were. And the flip side of that, though, too, is the non-product work was integrating into Salesforce. And that was, a different story entirely, but that was non-product work, and it was just needed to be done.
That sounds like a whole can of worms. Actually, before we get into the Salesforce integration, which I imagine posed a lot of challenges, can you talk a bit about what made Heroku special in those early days? Like, what was it that made it so like technically excellent, that made it such that like people still talk about it to this day? And in some sense, I feel like we're still playing, or we're trying to get back to the developer experience that they provided.
This going back to how I feel about it, but also what I've heard others say too, is back when Heroku first started, the idea of Git push Heroku master was literally like bringing a spaceship down to someone riding a lawnmower at the that's the most magnanimous, but maybe like trying to start fire with sticks type of deal. And it was so different, so advanced, so elegant, so clean that it was indistinguishable from magic. It literally was. And then even more than that, all the stuff that, Adam Wiggins in particular, the Heroku 12 factor app, and just thinking about what it means to actually write web applications, and what, putting that out there and saying, no, we're not going to bother with all these things. This is what it means to do that. Influenced so many different people, all these web frameworks, all these different ways in which we work, everything with that. So I think Rails was part of this, for what it's worth. Rails pushed this as well. So I think Rails pushed a lot of this. And then I think Heroku really pushed the concept and made it possible too. So you didn't have to string together 15, 20 different subsystems to get this out there. Because remember, before Heroku, you were literally still FTPing stuff or pushing things out and like having to run these different services in all these different ways. Like Heroku just took care of this. And then, of course, the very first time someone said, well, I'm pushing not just a Rails project, but a Python project, and Heroku's going to identify it, do the right things. And you're like, no, mind blown. I don't, whatever's happening over here,
Yeah. I mean, for like younger listeners, they probably don't understand what it was like, back in the days. We sound like old people, but, like Heroku, this was before, Netlify, before Vercel, before Docker, before like all these things that make deployment
Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Docker, Vercel, Cloudflare, all these things are greatly influenced by what Heroku did.
100%. And before Heroku, it was like, this is only like a couple of years after AWS first launched and became a thing too. Because even that, like people complain about AWS developer experience now and how difficult it is. But even just being able to like spin up a server on the fly by clicking a couple buttons, that was like a huge deal at the time. And what they did, essentially they basically like came in with the vision of like, hey, it should just be a Git push that deploys your software. That was kind of like mind blowing at the time, because like Git was more just like a version control system, and a not super well adopted one at that. People still using, I think I was still using like SVN and CVS in those days on some of the projects I worked on. But it was a really it was a big step forward in developer experience, and one that I think has demonstrably proven difficult to copy. Like there were a bunch of Heroku copycats that rose up alongside it, and I feel like only now are we getting back to the point with like some of these more like modern platform as a service or like developer platform companies. Only now are we getting back to that level of developer experience.
I think what we're seeing now too is finally people thinking about what it would look like now as opposed to what it did back then. And I think a lot of people tried to recreate Heroku, but Heroku wasn't even a finished product, in my opinion. I've talked about this publicly. I still think we should have gone deeper, and we had plans to go, paths up here and then escape hatch all the way down to all the way, config files and stuff like that, and do these magical things. But now you're seeing, Cloudflare workers and Vercel doing stuff at the edge, and Fly and Railway and others who are thinking about it a little bit differently, more modern, but they're thinking about it differently. So we're finally getting more fresh thinking again, as opposed to like, hey, I'm just going to try to recreate Heroku.
Yeah. 100%. Okay, so I'll be a little bit provocative here. Heroku had this amazing vision, and it kind of joined this really large business sales force that had a great enterprise sales engine. What happened? Like, why aren't we using? Why isn't everyone using Heroku today? Why isn't it ubiquitous?
Yeah, and I'll wade into danger territory here, obviously, because I'll be giving some of my personal opinion on that experience over there. And some other people's perceptions of the experience might be a little slightly different, but this is how I read this. One, you got acquired by Salesforce. We had a little bit of a honeymoon period with that, and we were, Heroku went and advanced certain aspects of its business kind of without Salesforce. And then all of a sudden, there was like kind of this integration feel. Hey, we got to get together with Salesforce, and we got to figure out what it means for Heroku to be a Salesforce entity. And ultimately, if you want to skip forward a whole bunch of details that we can dive into too, it just didn't work out. The acquisition was not viewed as a success. It was not viewed as ultimately a thing. Salesforce, and this is not like wading into too much danger territory, did not really understand Heroku and what it could possibly do. And it didn't know what to take advantage of it. And I think then there's a classic other things like, politicalness, hurt feelings, classic turf building type of stuff, all those other things at play. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the ultimate leadership at Salesforce didn't fully understand what Heroku was. Us at Heroku didn't fully understand how we could map into Salesforce. And we honestly, we had our own vision of what we wanted Heroku to be. And it was not ultimately going to be a Lightning subsystem. It was going to be a more generalized PaaS subsystem.
Lightning was this thing inside Sales. It's part of the Salesforce platform, right?
It is, yeah, and it's their version of what a platform is. You use there's a couple of different names for it, but like the the Salesforce Lightning platform, and that's like in our view was going to be too small for what we wanted to go achieve, and also it was narrowing down of what Heroku already was, so it felt like it was actually just being dismissive of what was its potential and possibilities were.
Yeah, interesting. So there was kind of this mismatch where the parent acquiring company wanted this to be part of this kind of existing platform that they're building up, and the acquired company wanted to still kind of develop that original vision into full fruition. In a way that
there's a lot of other details,
okay,
like in terms of sequencing and conversations and all that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, it was just a mismatch from that perspective. And the other side of it too was they were developing a competing platform internally too. They had an infrastructure organization that was developing a generalized infrastructure platform similar to Heroku, based on Kubernetes and all that sort of stuff. So then there was a politicalness of well, what happens? Do we collapse Heroku into this, or do we collapse this into Heroku? Which that was never going to happen. And so then then it had nothing to do with merit or possibilities anymore, and it had all to do, with the way that these things were going to slot up and have conversations with each other about all that. And that is a classic thing that happens with acquisitions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I've thought about this scenario of once a company gets large enough, at some point you are going to have two people or two teams that have the same idea, or maybe you acquire something that does something well, and it's there's some overlap with someone already inside the company, and it's I don't know that there's a good answer to this. Maybe you have thoughts on this, but if you're running a company, what is the right way to let good ideas play out in sort of a marketplace ideas, in sort of the marketplace of ideas? Because if these were two separate, companies competing with one another, you just both ship your thing, and then you'd have competition, and you'd kind of like do your own product discovery. But inside companies, because there's this like appeal to authority that is available, then you in some sense you get into this each team working on this feels like they're entitled to have like a monopoly on that problem space inside the company, or something or other. Like, is there a good way to do this?
So is there a good way to do this? I don't know. Because at the end of the day, I think it has almost nothing to do with the products and the projects, and almost has everything to do with how you set up your organization, what kind of incentives are aligned inside your organization, and how the communication politicalness of the organization flows. And all organizations have political. Political is a net neutral word in my opinion here. It's not positive, it's not negative. It's just political. It's like people communicating back and forth. But imagine you're Satya at Microsoft or Sundar over at Google or something like that, and you're trying to make decisions on all these sorts of things. How do you know and are able to make a decision if it comes to you to make a decision, or somebody else to make a decision and trust that? You have to like set up all these sorts of organizations and safeguards and all that. And it's impossible to get these things 100% right. So what I'd be worried about is directionally, are we achieving those goals? And this is why, ultimately, by the way, this is why I think very large organizations average down to like a very mediocre or slightly above average. And that is why they become, that way, but they still chug along and their earnings are so good, because ultimately it's not about the best decision or the even the most future-proof decision. It's about how it all kind of like fits into the broader landscape and how the whole machinery kind of moves. And it's an unsatisfying answer for folks like you and I who are all about like the thing that we're building. But at the end of the day, I've always joked with this, like on Twitter all the time, people will talk about Salesforce, the company, and it's an amazing stock. It's like one I own today personally.
Yeah.
And I will never use the product again because it's such a bad product. So there's two different sides of the fence. I'm never going to use the product, but I recognize that the company itself is a good value asset to own.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it definitely, a lot of people do use a product, and there's like many, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars spent on it, because it does add value to a lot of their customers. But at the same time, like, I get what you're saying. It's like from your own perspective, as like, wearing your product hat, what tool would I prefer to use? Like, there are better alternatives for me, but there's none that like you and I are not enterprises. Like, we're not complex, large, multi-department organizations, and there's a whole like it's like one part psychology, one part part product development too, but a lot of it is organizational psychology and checking the boxes. And
well, one of the things that I talk about quite a bit when you're building organizations, and I've thought about this, if eventually if I did take over a very large organization like this, how do you guard against this? And again, you're not trying to make 100% of the most optimal decisions. What you're trying to do is you're trying to aggregate the trend line this way. And so a technique that I've used forever, and I'm not sure how this scales, but you basically have what I call canaries all over the organization. And it's not just my direct reports, but it's people at all levels of the organization that you talk to. And they're not even just in your organization, but they're in other organizations too. And you're trying to, the two traits that they have is, one is they have broad awareness of what's happening, and so they can give you some insight into that. But two, they have like usually impeccable judgment. And what you're trying to do is aggregate information from that set of people so that you can kind of amalgamate it all together. And it's not that you're going to act on any one of those pieces of information, but it's the amalgamation of that information that's important. I kind of suspect it's similar, but it can't possibly be the way that I did it at GitHub for Sundar or Satya. And there's no, he might talk to fellows and he might talk to a bunch of VPs, but I doubt I only met with Satya twice after we were acquired. And it was all pleasantries. It wasn't about finding out about that sort of stuff. So you can't possibly work at that scale, but it is an interesting problem, right? It's almost like running a government.
Yeah. Someone, I think it was Mark Andreessen, actually, we were getting advice from him, and he was like, yeah, Microsoft viewed it as like a nation state. It's just like so many different like interest groups and internal egos evolved, and it's impressive in a way that we are able to build institutions that are share like a name and a brand that are so different across the people that comprise them.
Well, this is interesting. I ended up calling people ask me about the acquisition all the time from GitHub to Microsoft. And I said, hey, the easiest way to understand about how Microsoft operates is to think of it like an archipelago. I like the nation state analogy, but I said, think of it like an archipelago, which is below the waterline, the landmass that combines these island entities is titled Microsoft, but actually the islands are LinkedIn and Minecraft and Office and GitHub and others. And if you think about the types of things that go on inside the islands in terms of badness or goodness, you're correct. But if you think about what happens in between the islands too, that is also true. And so you can have the most positive of festivities, but you can also have the most negative and acrimonious as well.
Yeah. All right, this is a great segue actually. So what was the backstory to you actually getting in touch with GitHub? Actually, you're at Heroku at the time, and you took the CTO job at GitHub before the acquisition, right?
Yeah, I was there full time about 2 years total before we closed. We announced the acquisition right around my 1 year. I think it was almost to the day of my 1 year anniversary. I got in touch. So I never lived in San Francisco. I mentioned before, I was remote with Heroku, and people in San Francisco and Silicon Valley kind of started to know who I was based upon the Heroku effort. And then, you started getting some more calls for Silicon Valley stuff. And one of them was GitHub. And so kind of, entered the interview process. That took a long time. The interview process for me at GitHub was over a year, and they kicked me out at one point. I kicked them out at another point. It was like one of those types of processes. And, I was in many ways uniquely positioned to get that job and take it, given the Heroku and Canonical experience and a bunch of other things as well. But also, not a lot of people really wanted that job at the time, too. If you don't remember, GitHub had gone through a history of a bunch of different issues. So it wasn't the most sought after job. It, theoretically should have been the most prestigious CTO job in the Valley.
Yeah, I remember they were in fairly dire straits at that point, and there was kind of like outward commentary about how they hadn't really shipped anything big in a number of years, and there seemed to be like these like signs of internal chaos spilling out into the open as well.
Yeah, I mean that was the word in the street in terms of San Francisco, and two, that's where they were. That's what was happening. They famously got the Dear GitHub letter right around that time, which was the open source community saying, "Hey, you're not really listening to us. We'll take our stuff and go somewhere else." And as you mentioned, they hadn't really shipped stuff, and they had a bunch of internal things that were going on. From I think it was like 2013, 14, and 15. Then it was a multi-year period where things were not going well. In that regard. In fact, what I mentioned on a couple of different podcasts too, but the story with taking the GitHub job was I asked a bunch of my friends, 20 plus people, and all of them basically said, no, don't take that job. You can't fix founders, you can't fix boards, you can't fix culture, you can't fix a lot of that stuff. But my boss at the time at Heroku, this guy named Adam Gross, who I'm still very good friends with, and I think is one of the most wonderful people in Silicon Valley, let alone one of the smartest too. He said to me, "Oh, absolutely, you need to take that job." He goes, "One, it's tailor-made for you. Two, they've burned through how many CTOs in the last couple of years? So if you fail, it's just GitHub. But if you're able to pull it off and succeed at all, you're a legend." And like literally word for word, as if what he said to me. And I was like, literally like, oh my God, Adam, like, that's a definition of betting on myself. You're right. Like he goes, yeah, I know you've been looking for a way to do this and Salesforce hasn't been giving it to you. So like, this is tailor-made for you. Go do it. Yeah. If you fail, which is the high chance, like the odds on favor is for you not to be able to pull this off. Great. It's just GitHub though. Move on, take that high paying job at Google or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that is maybe like a general pattern for how to put yourself in the right mindset. It's like there are times when you're viewing at like a potential situation or opportunity and you're thinking only of the downside, right? Like if you're looking at like, GitHub at that point, you're like, oh, there's so many things wrong with this. It's probably going to go wrong. You're focusing on the downside case. But then like the way you actually get to take those like meaningful, pivotal risks in your life is to think about the upside. It's like, what's the worst that can happen? Company's a mess. It's just GitHub. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But look at the upside. Like if you're able to actually turn the ship around, then
well, in many ways,
like
too,
you said,
it looks like a VC
now.
bet. Yeah, it kind of looks like a VC bet too, which is like, hey, we can only lose the capital we put in, but if it works how does it work? It's unbounded upside too. Given that you're a Redpoint portfolio company, you know how we think about these things too. And in that way, that's what it kind of looked like. And in fact, like Adam and I talked about this at length too, because he said, "Hey, this is not, it's not fully capped downside. There is a chance that you could fully get kicked out of tech in San Francisco." um, he said,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the way that you would do that at GitHub, because GitHub had an internal culture where they were trying to cancel each other and for various things too. And he said, the way that would happen for you is a set of things that are so far outside of you as a person and your character that they're like, there's no risk for you to do those. So if you look at it from that perspective, they're already outside your bounds. Somebody else might trip on those, but that's not you. So therefore, go nuts.
So what was it like stepping into this role? What were like the top 2 to 3 challenges that you kind of identified, and what was your game plan for turning things around?
Well, I mean, the very first thing you walk into, you always kind of walk in with like a rough idea, and I've talked about before, I have a notebook, an old GitHub notebook that showed like a multi-year idea of what I would think we would want to do there. But that's just from the product perspective. And yes, that's an incredibly important one, but there's also all the other things too, culture and company building and recruiting, and the flip side of recruiting of like removing toxic elements and things of that nature too. So you have all those things at play. But the number one thing I thought was most important was, one, don't get fired. So I had to establish myself quickly, earn trust with the right people, show them my competence, and ship some stuff. So you had to break the calcification as much as possible in GitHub for not shipping, and ship some things. And so once you kind of dive in and dig in, you start to see a broader set of things that are going to support those goals. But overall, it's actually not that difficult to think about what it took to do that. Was ship some stuff, make some bold decisions, make sure that the direction you're picking for the product and the company is apt and true and right and will pay off in dividends. And 3, make sure that also everything else about you is above board and impeccable, so that you can do those things. Because if you're bogged down in other things, it's going to take some time. Then on the flip side, you had to build out the internal systems. And the company building side of GitHub was actually much harder than the product building side of GitHub.
Interesting. Do you recall what that first like big decision or that first thing that you were able to ship was?
I remember walking into a meeting. I started on May 31st, 2017. And it was June 14, 15, 16, somewhere along those lines, where we're in a universe prep meeting. And I don't remember the exact date for universe that year, but it was October of 2017. And I remember when I'm in this universe prep, I'm like, all right, so like, what's the plan for universe? Like, let's walk through this. And everyone was looking at me and they're like, oh no, you need to tell us what we're doing for universe, like what we're supposed to ship, like which. And I was like, it's middle of June. What are you talking about? Like we don't have even like a thematic idea of what we're doing. Like, nope, no idea. And so literally I just went through and I met with everyone over the course of about the next week. And I said, show me every project that you have in flight right now that is capable of being shipped for October. And we got to start like, yes, 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 no, 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 knowing these things, and start picking a couple of flagships and building a theme for it. So working backwards. So that was the first set of things that I did. Meanwhile, I also had to go on tour with the customers to regain some trust because of some things that we had done. So in between, I was trying to do those things. And that actually led me to a couple of other product things that we were going to eventually go do. But I believe the very first one was a project internally we called Bumblebee, which was all about artificial intelligence and security alerts. So we started to push that forward, and the team that worked on that really hammered it out really quickly. They did a stellar job, and I remember us launching that. But it still was kind of a light plate for Universe that year. And so one of the things we really had to do was kind of like tip our hand a little bit and forecast what we will do the next year. And that's when we first started talking about GitHub as a platform. GitHub, that's where, actions started coming out and stuff like that. We talked about deploy at that very first universe, and CI and CD and stuff like that.
And you mentioned earlier when we were talking that there were a couple like key people that ended up being like really important in this turnaround effort. Who were those people, and how did they fit into the changes that you were trying to drive?
Yeah. So one of the things with GitHub was across the board, the cupboards were stocked with excellent people in many different functions. So the sales team at the time, led by Paul St. John and a couple of others, was amazing. They were an enterprise sales team. They were knocking down doors and pulling in revenue from that perspective. Finance was getting its act in order. They just had a guy named Mike Taylor. But on the product engineering and design side, that is where they had a lot of really good people, excellent people, quality people. A lot of them just hadn't been unlocked yet, or kind of were frustrated. So in particular, not to like just call out a set of people, but GitHub Actions doesn't happen without Sam Lambert and his entire infrastructure team, as well as another one who was not at GitHub at the time, but we recruited in someone named Max Schoening. So without those two, GitHub Actions doesn't happen. And then inside the engineering or the infrastructure organization, you've got guys named like Peaky, Sam Kotler, who basically put together all the data centers with his team, and Ross, who did all the networking and all that. So you get like these hero folks who ran this stuff. Too many people to call out, but again, a couple others I want to highlight. This guy named Kyle Daigle. Every time we run into Universe, Mark Otto and Kyle Daigle. Mark is one of the original creators, if not I think the original, of Bootstrap. And he was running in the brand organization and website organization at GitHub. So he's the one who like pulled together Universe almost every year. And then Kyle as well. Kyle's an engineering manager or director. I can't remember his specific title at the time. All of a sudden, Universe is off the rails. Kyle and Mark come together, and next thing you know, it ships again. And it's like that type of stuff. Then, of course, there's other people throughout the organization too. A couple of heads of HR or HRBPs, head of talent, and other engineering managers or leaders kind of strewn throughout the organization that I really leaned on.
Interesting. Yeah, you draw the distinction between sales and finance, which were kind of like relatively well run at that point, versus product and engineering. I almost feel that might be like a general pattern, at least from folks that I talk to. I think it's because when you're talking about like sales, when you're talking about finance, like those are, to me, speaking obviously as an engineer, so obviously like everyone else's job is way easier than mine, but like to me, it seems like those departments have kind of well-established playbooks, right? There is kind of like an enterprise sales playbook, which is not completely, but mostly generalizable. From company to company, if you're doing SaaS, if it's like the same go-to-market motion. Finance, there's like the standard accounting practices, and you obviously have to fit that with the company, but there's kind of like a basic template or playbook to do that. For product and engineering, I feel like there isn't as strong of a like this is the one way to do things, and this is kind of like
no,
there it's that's not right.
I absolutely do, and I think in many ways. So if you think about what sales does, is they take something that's developed by other people. Yes, there's input from them, but they're effectively packaging it in a way that's consumable by an audience, and they're trying to find a way to pitch it and all that sort of stuff. I'm not being dismissive. I'm saying what they're doing. Their job is incredibly hard, but it's after a certain event has already happened. And in GitHub's case, what made them world class was it was not an enterprise ready product in 2017, and yet they were still selling it to a remarkable degree because that's how good a sales team that they were. But it was a pretty established playbook for this. You need X, Y, and Z documentation. Here's how you structure your organization. Here's the ratios of all the different people inside of the organization. Here's how you expand territory, all that. In product and engineering, I think it's different. And this is why I think that I had some success to whatever degree I did, was I came in and I was not mechanical about how we're going to go do engineering, but I said, here's what we're going to go build and why. And it was more about the long-term vision, the strategic nature of it, as well as then building the organization to achieve that, and then getting people on board to go do that. And no one would ever accuse me of being a very in the details engineering manager when it comes to like, this is how the CI system works. Here's all the way the tickets get bound together. Here's all the blah, blah, blah. But that's not what most organizations need, actually, because there's a function that actually will handle that at some point. But that's where a lot of what I think earlier companies, and I would put GitHub in its maturity curve before I joined as very early in this maturity curve, that's where they focus. They focus on like very small details or very small minor things because that's what's comfortable to a lot of people around it. You got to like raise that level of conversation all the way up to this. and then give them a big 5-year, 10-year arc and start to talk about all those things together. Then you have to actually be able to paint the picture down enough to the point, or hire enough people to fill in the gaps.
Do you think there is, or there will be someday, like a standard operating model for product and engineering? And if not, like, do you at least have like a list of kind of common do's and don'ts?
I think as organizations scale, I do talk to other companies about this as they go. What happens is that the way that organizations are going to work is roughly similar. Now, as soon as I say this, somebody on Twitter is going to be like, "That's not how we work." Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Okay, I get that, but give me some liberties here, and basically say this: is 2 people in a garage with a dog should literally be using GitHub plus Heroku or whatever we talk about the modern paths today, Rails, Python, or something to build SaaS-based web applications for the most part. Unless you're an infrastructure company, why are you bothering with Rust or all these other things, right? But you get the idea. And it's a monolithic one. It's a monolithic on purpose because it's easy and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's actually what an organization looks like too. It's largely a monolith. The first 5-10 engineers you hire for a company, they're largely generalists or working on the Rails application or the Python application or whatever it is. You get the idea. But as the organization expands and scales, all the same sorts of departments and problems start to have to be stamped out. So I think that we largely already have this, but there's not that many companies who ultimately get to the point where you need it. You guys need this. Now, we've talked about this in the past, you and I, but you largely end up with like an infrastructure team and an application engineering team and a data team. And then there's questions of like, well, do the data analysts sit inside the data team, or are they the data infrastructure team? And all that stuff is like a little bit noise right now, but you get the idea. You start breaking these things up and you start deconstructing the monolith a little bit, and you're figuring out the various optimizations. Application engineering team, you want them to go as fast as possible. The infrastructure team, you want them to provide as much safety as possible. Those are in conflict. How do you resolve that? And you can see how that might go. And I think the tight loop iterations, the Dora report, all that sort of stuff, multiple releases per day, we kind of already do know this. We just haven't written it down yet. I think we're in the past emergent, but before it becomes prescribed phase of this.
Got it. Makes sense. We're almost at the end of the hour. There's 2 things I want to cover before we end. One is your work at Redpoint now, but before that, just real quick, on the acquisition, at what point did you or did the company decide that it wanted to be acquired, and how did that all kind of like play out?
So there's a bunch of different stories to tell inside this, and I won't be able to go into too much depth, but I'll say this is that Chris, the remaining founder at GitHub, wasn't really involved in the company. He had already announced that he was transitioning out, looking for a new CEO. He kind of stopped showing up, all that sort of stuff. And we had been working, the people who were at GitHub were working with a lot of the partners, the IBMs, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons, all the big cloud providers. And I mean, those of us who were doing what we were doing, building the partnerships there, knew what we were doing. We were building these deep connections with these people who were eventually going to either get interested enough to like deeply partner with us or acquire us. And I can't say when Chris decided that he was going to take one of the acquisition offers, but I knew within the first 4 months that we were going to get several in the first couple in that year. It was obvious given the partnerships that we were doing. And it really kind of ramped up when we showed privately the thing that became GitHub Actions. We called it GitHub Launch at the time. When we privately showed that to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, et cetera, the world, you can see they go, GitHub knows its value. And if we don't do something about this, somebody else will. There was a big fear at that moment, which was for a long time, GitHub didn't know its strategic value. Now it does. If we don't do something, somebody else will. Therefore, we can't let this thing continue independent anymore. I don't know what
was
Chris
it because
was
like Actions was this like it connected the dots from like source control to like runtime, like compute resources.
Even backing up a little bit before, I said there's 4 fundamental entities in the world that could fundamentally entirely change software just by pushing a product. And that's, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and GitHub. And, pre-acquisition by Microsoft, one of those didn't look like the others. And in fact, GitHub was the most important because GitHub sat here in the chain, whereas all the other ones were in production land.
Yeah, and what GitHub was upstream of all the others.
Upstream. And so what we very clearly did with that GitHub Launch, but GitHub Actions project was said, and we showed a multi-year roadmap of what we're going to do. Still, a lot of the stuff hasn't been released yet. And we showed them, said, we know our strategic value and we have more of it than you. You have more revenue. You will always be able to monetize this better. But if we turn you off, you're dead. And in fact, we showed them this. I walked into a meeting with the Microsoft execs and the Google execs, and because we were able to see egress traffic, I was able to tell them more about Azure and AWS for Amazon and GCP than they knew about their business fundamentally. And that's when they can start to connect those dots, you understand what would happen.
Do you ever wonder, what might have happened had GitHub stayed an independent company? Is that ever something?
I do, but it's also one of those that, one, it made my career. It's hard to lament that. Two, I grew up incredibly poor, so like I'm not anymore, and it's also a really nice feeling. But you do worry, you do wonder about that. But at the same time, a whole bunch of other things had to go right too. What if the new CEO and I did to get along? Yeah, I mean, I was driving all of these things inside of that, but there's always that chance that, hey, I'm part of the thing that needs to get excised to fix GitHub. Okay, so I can't second guess that at all. I do hope that GitHub still finishes a bunch of the stuff, and I know a bunch of people there are working on these things. But you can, if you blur at all, you understand with code spaces and Copilot and GitHub Actions and all the security alerts and all the different things. Eventually, if you think about what does it look like to embed a Heroku or something like this, but not again, not Heroku from 5 years ago, but Heroku from 5 years from now. What does it look like to do that? You can get the idea of what we were heading towards. And then I'm super excited to see what some of the GitHubbers do now. Like Sam is now CEO at Planet Scale, and they're killing it. And they're bringing a whole bunch of innovations to the database side of the world, similar to what we talked about at GitHub. And those were all his and Max's brainchild. So it's like, it'd be exciting to see what they're doing over there too.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a good segue into kind of like the final thing I want to chat about, which is what you're up to now. Your transition from operator to venture capital land, and investing in dev tools at Redpoint.
So yeah, joined Redpoint last year. So it's been just over a year now, and Redpoint is, as you mentioned, one of the more storied Silicon Valley VCs. And our focus is really on infrastructure, so deep tech infrastructure, and that's why it appeals to me. So that's my focus, working with startups like yourself and others, trying to find the next big infrastructure players. My background, given the companies you mentioned, but also the distributed systems, scaling companies, all of that, like it kind of lends itself to those types of startups. And that's what we're looking for, is all those next ones, the next GitHubs and Herokus and Sourcegraphs of the world.
Nice. Yeah, and I will say that like Sourcegraph, of course, is a Redpoint portfolio company. From our point of view, they were one of the investors that was ahead of the curve in this game. In 2013, when we started the company, you said the words dev tools to most VCs, and they get up and run in the opposite direction, because everybody knew back then that there was no money in dev tools. And I guess you had a big hand in changing that tune with the GitHub acquisition.
The irony of this is that I do think that GitHub did change a lot of that. But also Scott Rainey, who is one of the partners here at Redpoint, was the first outside investor in Heroku. So Scott has been way ahead of this trend for a long time. Then Redpoint as well, Sartish in the database side of the world, and just in general, Redpoint looks at these things, and that's what we're after. It's after that next generation. And yeah, like it's a different type of business than investing in all these consumers and cryptos of the world, but it's what we do and love, and that's why we're attracted to this.
Yeah. Do you have any words of advice for people out there listening who might be thinking about starting the next great dev tools company?
So I think just in general, when it comes to dev tools, infrastructure, all of them, a couple of things matter. One is you might have the best system in the world that no one ever wants to use. So you really have to get somebody somewhere to validate some aspect of something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at all, but you have to have some core central thesis that you're going to get validated by a customer. And this could just be like literally open source adoption. We talk about that side of things quite a bit. But a lot of people who are starting infrastructure or dev tools companies don't like to talk to people. They think that if they build it, they will come. And that's just not the way that most of these things work. Sometimes you get lucky and it does. And I'm not going to discount that, but don't count on luck. You got to build that mechanism to do that. And, talk to people about how you do that. And the other side of the fence is to don't overthink it. Really don't. Like, just start developing, some stuff. Don't worry about picking the exact right language and the exact right framework and stuff. Like literally, like, don't agonize over these things. Prove out some stuff, and once you get to the point you've earned the right to care about that sort of thing, that's going to be a really good day.
Is there anything they should do to get in touch with you or Redpoint?
So I'm just Jason at redpoint.com, and Redpoint is redpoint.com, and we're all super accessible on there. I'm begrudgingly active on Twitter at Jason C. Warner. So Jason C as in cat, Warner. And you can always get me via DM that way too.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are on Twitter for the same reasons. I'm on there because developers. That's where a lot of developer conversations happen. So it is kind of the effective developer social network. So you get both the good and the bad.
You do, and aggressively start to mute, but use lists. Lists have actually been a very big help for me on Twitter.
Lists are great. I highly recommend lists. All right. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We're already a little bit over. Thanks so much for chatting, Jason. This is a really enlightening conversation.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.